So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the weekly Facebook Live, but not only Facebook Live, LinkedIn Live, YouTube Live, called Learning Connects by the European Training Foundation. I apologize for the delay, but we've encountered some technical issues, which I'm sure it's something the whole humanity is experiencing in these firstly digital days. The topic we are going to discuss today is very relevant for all of us, for each and every one of us, because we will be discussing about labor market policies for recovery, which I'm sure it's very relevant, because we think it's very important to discuss and to share what are the new trends and innovations in the labor market interventions, and what countries are doing, and how we can also help the countries as international organizations to cope with a post-pandemic phase. I'd like to invite each and every one of you who is following us to send questions, send comments, and most of all, say hi and let us know where you are from. But now let's go straight into the business by welcoming our distinguished guests. I'd like to thank Dajna Sorensen, Deputy Minister of Finance and Economy at the Ministry of Finance and Economy of Albania. Welcome, Dajna.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you for being with us. I'd like to thank Eamonn Davern, Senior Labor Market Expert at Fondazione Giacomo Brodolini. Thanks, Eamonn, for being with us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you.
And I'd like to thank my colleague, Cristina Mereuta, Labor Market Expert at the European Training Foundation. Thank you for being with us, Cristina.
Hello, thank you.
So let's go straight into the discussion, because we've lost a few minutes at the very beginning. Cristina, the European Training Foundation has commissioned two studies on the innovation and the effectiveness of labor market interventions, particularly in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. You would explain it way better than I do, but the scope was to identify the main lessons and messages for the next generation of policies and measures aimed at human capital development and improved labor market performance. So why, Cristina, should we be talking about labor market policies during a crisis rather than focusing on quick fix responses? Over to you.
Thank you, Daria. Why? Because history teaches us like that. So the idea of these two of the studies were to look at the lessons learned from previous crises, but also to look at the typology and the impact of this current crisis, and to look at the implications, the policy implications. Of course, in any kind of crisis, you need to work with quick fix solutions and responses, and we notice that most of the ETF partner countries, and not only around the world, countries have invested heavily in job protection, in support to businesses, economic stabilization, and so on. We noticed also that the public employment services in general were overwhelmed with high influx of unemployed people, job seekers, new type of job seekers, redundant workers, and so on. At the same time, we feared that the human capital development, the upskilling, reskilling, skills development element is maybe less present. And indeed, it was rather less present, at least in the first month of the crisis last year. At the same time, we wanted to capture two overlapping trends that we see now, the impact of pandemic, but also pre-existing changes that were already present in our economy, societies, and so on, particularly digitalization. And we know already that sectors, trade patterns, employment demand, and so on, and way of working will not go back to the pre-existing, to the pre-pandemic times. So for this reason, we looked at these two elements: innovation, reforms of active labor market policies with focus on skilling and upskilling element and human capital development, but also we looked at effectiveness and efficiency of measures, because in any crisis there is this time to look fairly and to have a fair and honest reflection on what is working in terms of activation measures, what are the new typologies of clients and vulnerabilities. We know already that we will face growing vulnerabilities both in terms of magnitude, more people in vulnerable situations, but also in terms of, from kind of qualitative point of view, types of vulnerabilities. So for this reason, we tried to document the challenges and the responses to crisis. We wanted to reveal innovative and affordable solutions, and Eamonn will talk more about those elements. And we wanted to give a new impetus to mutual learning that's cross-country exchanges. It's a pleasure, and I'm really happy that Ms. Sorensen accepted our invitation, because she represents a government of the country that innovated and tried to innovate a lot in terms of labor market measures, particularly in the context of crisis. We have already organized several exchanges and cross-country exchanges last year in October and December. So we hope that all these elements that we gather now and we document with the support of Fondazione Brodolini in these two studies will help countries to shape somehow or to rethink the new generation of employment policies that definitely need to capture the upskilling element, the human capital element.
Thank you so much, Cristina, for setting the scene. We will go back to a number of issues you have already touched upon, such as the focus on the vulnerable groups, the spotlight on skills and human capital development. But since you refer to our distinguished speakers, I'd like to give the floor now to Dajna Sorensen to know more about her country's experiences. So Dajna is Deputy Minister of Finance and Economy of Albania. You could bring to the discussion the perspective of your country. Can you share with our followers how has the Albanian government dealt with the pandemic? What was included in the responsive action plan, and what were the key elements? Over to you, Dajna.
Thank you, Daria. First of all, it's really nice to be here today with Cristina and with Eamonn, and to discuss about the measures that were taken in the context of COVID-19. In Albania, we have an interesting setting where the Ministry of Finance and Economy is responsible for finance, is responsible for economic development, it's responsible for labor market policies, and for vocational education and training. So it is really a crucial ministry that looks at the crisis from multiple angles, from retaining macroeconomic stability in the country, but as well as ensuring that the private sector get the support that it requires, and all those individuals that have exited the labor market are returned to the labor market as quickly as possible. With the beginning of the pandemic, I think the priority was to ensure that as little job shedding occurred as possible, and most of the government support was channeled toward ensuring that companies had some incentives in place to retain as many of their workers as possible. In total, we had two different support packages. The first support package doubled unemployment benefits for existing beneficiaries of unemployment benefits. It doubled cash assistance program benefits for a period of 3 months, as well as it provided subsidies to companies, to small companies in particular, for their existing workers, for people that were self-employed, as well as for individuals that were unpaid family members. Now, the second support package extended support to the remainder of small companies that, even though they were not shut down by government decree, of course, they experienced a significant slowdown in their economic activity. In addition, beyond these two specific measures, there was also loan guarantees that were provided, two different ones. One loan guarantee was for paying the salaries of workers, for companies that were experiencing dwindling cash flows, as well as another second loan guarantee for working capital for companies that were affected by the pandemic. Now, in a nutshell, these were the types of measures that were initially taken in Albania at the very beginning of the pandemic, and I'm talking about the period March till June of 2020. I think one element that I would like to emphasize is also the fact that, if anything, the pandemic in itself highlighted the importance of some of the reforms that many countries had already initiated. So it is really not necessarily only about reinventing and finding new solutions. That is also important, but I think it's also a far cry for pushing forward at a greater speed some of the reforms that we had already been working on for quite some time, so that now require a new impetus.
Thank you very much. So it's an interesting point that you've just added to the discussion, which is not only about the responses that the countries are giving today, but also building on what was done in the past, also as a lesson for future development. We go back to this, Dajna, because not only it's very interesting to know more from your country, but also because very often, at least for those like me, who are, let's say, journalists and dealing with the media sphere, very often discussions are country-based. So sometimes it's not even some info are not even accessible. It's rare to know what's happening in another country, which is affected by the pandemic, the responses which are given by this other country. So it's also to get inspiration and place ourselves in the word and not only be at the center. Eamonn, you are the author of the report on innovation in active labor market programs and public employment services. So from your perspective, from the study you've run, what are the main strands for interventions and actions that you have identified, and what type of measures have been adopted, you've seen have been adopted in the pandemic? Eamonn.
Thank you very much, Daria. First of all, I should say I was the joint author with a colleague, Lucas Sankovic, as well, so we jointly produced the study. I think I'd echo very much the points of the two previous speakers. One theme is that perhaps many pre-existing trends and policy responses have been fast-tracked because of COVID, and I've heard colleagues say that we've had perhaps 6 years planned change in 6 months as a rapid necessary response to the crisis. From the report, my colleague and I noted a particular trend in some combining of short time work with vocational training, an emerging trend in many countries, particularly in Germany. There's been a degree of a further adaptation of vocational training, often looking at trying to equip more citizens with the skills to access digital jobs, both because I think many employers have moved more rapidly towards digitalization and automation as a consequence of the crisis for various reasons, and again a pre-existing trend towards more digital delivery as part of the fourth industrial revolution we're all in the midst of. So new forms of training, very much a theme from the COVID response. Perhaps a more proactive response from the support institutions, including, of course, the public employment services, more of a focus on looking at mismatches and different approaches to identify and rectify these. We came across some particularly interesting examples from Bulgaria and Croatia of examples of trying to identify particular skill shortages and opportunities to upskill job seekers to enable them to take advantage of those opportunities. We didn't identify as many examples of wage subsidies as we thought we might, which is quite interesting and perhaps something that may merit some further investigation. But there was a particular example in Portugal looking at identifying subsidies in the healthcare sector, which had an obvious relevance to the particular sort of emergency situation of the crisis, and a very innovative scheme from Montenegro, where the government, through the Public Employment Service, were looking at identifying opportunities for new employment areas, supporting employers in emerging sectors, and using this as a vehicle to ensure a transition of more people from the informal to the informal sector. So both workers moving from a more precarious to a more stable formal employment situation, and encouraging companies perhaps to make that transition as well, which is obviously to everybody's benefit. Some focus on public work schemes, and indeed some innovative approaches to public works we identified, I think particularly in Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan and Armenia, where there was a view that it was a good opportunity to particularly orientate and steer public work activity towards structural issues engaging with the environmental crisis. So a good opportunity to address two particular significant issues through one change. In terms of the more delivery implications and adjustments, a key issue, of course, for all governments and employment services was keeping staff and customers safe, essentially. So as a consequence, there was obviously a move where feasible to more online and digital contact with clients, but perhaps we can pursue that a bit later. Lots of use of short-time work schemes. Examples, again, I think in Egypt, Kosovo, Serbia, North Macedonia and Russia, amongst others. Uzbekistan was fairly creative, looking at an interest-free loan scheme for enterprises affected by the crisis to support temporarily cessation or declining in demand affecting their trading situation. And perhaps finally, there have been a number of procedural changes to unemployment benefit systems, with easements in some of the requirements for citizens to increase their registration at a certain time. Some easements saying you don't have to re-register perhaps every month as you used to previously. More movement towards some online registration. Croatia moving towards taking registrations over the phone, and an overall trend on attempting to reduce administrative burden. And I think finally, perhaps we also came across an example in the Ukraine where some deferred registration systems were introduced, where the confirmation would actually proceed at a certain period after certain lockdown restrictions were ended. So some expedient approaches to easing the administration of unemployment benefits schemes, some changes to increase people's access to them, and an overall reorientation of some of the vocational support to meet some trends from the crisis and support employers perhaps particularly likely to emerging from the crisis with even more demand for their services.
Thank you very much, Eamonn, also for this overview, this flight we've done all over several countries. I'm pleased to say that that we have many followers from the EU neighborhood and beyond. Some of them are in countries you've mentioned. I would like to say hi to Kazimov from Azerbaijan, to friends from Algeria, Belamel and Amin. We have Grazia and Romain from Italy, Minir from Kosovo, Claudia from Portugal, we have just mentioned, Abraham from Mexico, Joanna from Denmark, Joji from India, Joe from Torino, Anahit from Armenia, Vital from India. So as you can see, this conversation is targeting a wide geographic scope. So let's continue in this way, and please send your questions and comments if you have any. We'll go back to you, Eamonn, later on to know more also of the digital aspects you've touched upon. And I'd like to go back to Cristina for a moment, because when we talk about the labor markets of today, we talk also about the adults of today. But what's in there for the inactive adults? What are the challenges, but also the good practices in adult education for tackling the crisis? Cristina.
Thank you. Thank you for this excellent question. And actually, I would link it to what just Eamonn said. Some of these actions have also eased the eligibility criteria, but also targeted a wider inclusion of adults accessing employment services or other type of services. Countries were very, very smart in opening up and providing this type of support to wider categories like informal workers, like ex-migrants, not to forget that most ETF partner countries are countries of emigration towards the European Union, and the immediate impact in March, April was a sudden move back to their countries of origin, and the countries and the governments have provided this access, which was essential. But beyond social protection, income support element, I think there is a huge potential there with this higher registration levels to somehow address the informality, beyond addressing through control, through punishments and labor legislation rules, tougher enforcement and so on. With such approach, that it's balancing a bit the support to individuals in various contexts. And I go back now to your questions, because most of the adults that do not have sufficient access to training, retraining, further education are also adults being informal workers, or quite poor, exposed to social vulnerabilities and so on. So in general, in the ETF partner countries, this is the typology, if I can say, or the profile of inactive adults. And this is also it signals a change of understanding of and also in the scope of active labor market programs in developing and transition countries, that should not only target job seekers and those that are closer to the labor market, should in general try to approach also those that are farther away from jobs, so those that are not actively seeking a job, those that are inactive. And actually, this is the challenge in most ETF partner countries. It's not necessarily the unemployment. Although if we look at rates, they are high. But if we look at actual numbers, we see that there is a huge cohort of inactive people, and there are many reasons behind. I would only list the fact that there are insufficient job opportunities. Why people are not looking for jobs? Because there are no jobs available in their region, in their looking responding to their or fit for their skill sets on. There is the issue of quality of employment opportunities everywhere, not only in the ETF partner countries. And here I would mention the wage differentials. That's why also you have a high propensity for immigration. But there are issues of health and safety at work, issues with the informality in general, enforcement of labor legislation, long working hours. So where statistics is available, the Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, and many ETF partner countries face one of the longest working hours per week, over 40, 42, 43, 45. So that really signals a problem with the quality of jobs available, pay gaps, gender gaps, and all these aspects. The other reason of or barriers, of not having these higher employment rates is also that sometimes employers expect ready-made workers, if I can say like that, be it young graduates or even adults that have been job seekers before. So I would say that empirically I see that there is an issue also with the integration of a fresh, recently hired worker in enterprises. There are insufficient mentorship and coaching schemes applied at company level. Skill set, the mismatch between demand and supply, it's an old story, it's still valid, and it will become even more, quite worse in the next years due to digitalization and all this greening change and so on. For women, lack of affordable childcare or family dependent members is a barrier. It's a huge problem. Not least, in many countries we see an uneven development at regional level. So we have regions with a lot of opportunities, mostly capital cities that attract most of the investments and so on, and with a poor internal mobility due to, poor physical infrastructure or insufficiently developed digital infrastructure. Even if all the employment offices go for a huge investment in coaching, training, and so on, those people cannot access a job sustainably. So we notice the data that there have been a lot of forecasts on how the GDP will go down, on the employment losses in jobs and so on. For me personally, I wanted to see also the labor force survey results, and we are now getting the results of 2020, at least the third quarter and so on. And actually it confirms, these trends confirm something that I expected, that in the developing transition countries, but not only, in certain EU member states, people tend to withdraw from the labor market. So people tend to become inactive and less unemployed. Yeah, so there is this tendency to see this, and that this has a huge impact on the activation strategies, because it's in one way you can work as an employment policy maker or an employment counselor at for public employment service. In one way you can work with a person that is ready and is actively looking for a job. In a completely another way you work with a person that is really lost any hope to find a job and it's not motivated and so on. Therefore, you ask me about practices. I mean, the good practices I saw in many Western Balkans countries, for example, is a very solid cooperation at community level, partnership approach, collaboration, strong cooperation, and this was also tested already in Albania between the VET or skills development providers, employment offices, social care, social assistance offices, and so on. So it to invest in the skills development of inactive adults, you need this kind of partnership. You need a smart combination of activation measures with other measures that support the participants, like health, like housing, removing all this stigma and discrimination. So it's really, really rather complex. And the final point I want to make, I think we need, as policymakers and also advisor, we need to understand that also the way we assess the performance in the implementation of certain activation policies needs to change. Because often if we look at the literature, and this is emerging from the studies Eamonn and Lukács have developed, from the literature we see that typically ALMPs, active labor market programs, are evaluated looking at the employment outcome. Yeah, so how many people or the rate of the participants, the employment rate of participants, yeah, at the end of the program, or 6 months after program, or 1 year after. But the problem is that when you work with people that are rather disadvantaged, like the one on inactive adults, you need maybe to look at the results that tell you that those people are closer to the labor market, not necessarily are employed, but simply they are more, they are ready to take up a job or to go to other trainings, additional trainings, and so on. So, and that has an impact also on the way we address informality and many other issues that are on the labor market.
Thank you, Cristina.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cristina. I think you gave us a very clear overview of the issues. Before going back to our outline of questions, I'd like to bring in the conversation the questions from our audience, because I think that they can contribute to shaping the discussion. Maybe the first one we could pass it on to Dajna if she's willing to answer, from Romain. So how to find the balance between supporting people and supporting jobs? How is it the case from Albania, Dajna?
Yeah, I think that is a very interesting question indeed. I think it has to happen in parallel. There has to be support for individuals that are exiting the labor market, as well as incentives for companies to retain as many of their workers as possible, as well as expand and employ new individuals. What we have noticed in Albania is that a very small share of companies have actually shedded jobs. In other words, the majority of the companies have retained their existing workers, which goes very much in line with what Cristina was mentioning earlier. From GDP drop that we have noticed in our countries, we would expect a larger drop in employment. And we haven't necessarily seen that. At least in the formal labor market, what we have noticed is that it has bounced back rather quickly. So for instance, in the formal job market, we have seen that, yes, there was a significant dip in March and April, and to a certain extent in May of 2020. But by December of 2020, in the case of Albania, for instance, we had returned to formal employment levels that were higher than prior to the pandemic, which is quite interesting. But I also have to echo what was mentioned by Cristina a little bit earlier, the fact that we have, however, seen a significant increase in the number of individuals that are now inactive. Also, we noticed that the individuals that exited the labor market, at least again, the formal labor market, are not necessarily the same individuals that are entering now the labor market. And I think that is very important to see and to design programs that capture these individuals that have exited the labor market but are not necessarily returning. In the case of Albania, we have 5 mainstream active labor market programs that are subsidized employment, of course, which is a standard program, on-the-job training, internship programs, self-employment, and community employment. These are programs that really look at the most vulnerable, those that are probably at the margins of the labor market, and support their labor market migration. However, we introduced also 2 new ALMPs in 2020. One that targeted specifically this vulnerable group that I just mentioned earlier, that are the individuals that exited, but for some reason were not re-entering into the labor market, as well as another category that is very relevant for the Albanian context, which are the informal workers. Anybody that was willing to self-declare as being employed informally prior to the pandemic has been supported for a period of 12 months through an active labor market program specifically designed for that individual. Again, all these measures that I mentioned are a combination of incentives for companies to hire people back, but as well as measures to support the individual for their labor market reintegration. I think from a private sector development perspective, however, I think the funds that are put into ALMPs really have to be matched with funds that allow for companies to grow, to generate more jobs, but more importantly, to generate better quality jobs than what they have in the past. And what do I mean by better quality? I mean better paying jobs, jobs that have better working conditions, that are more attractive to individuals, particularly young people in the context of a significant brain drain, especially from our region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dajna.
Thank you very much, Dajna.
Going back to the healthcare sector, which was mentioned earlier on by Eamonn, there's a comment by Claudia Teixeira from Portugal saying, however, the pandemic revealed to be a driver of precariousness also in healthcare. A big percentage of signed contracts were just temporary and a result of short-term employment policies. Would you like to comment on that, Eamonn?
Yes, I mean, clearly there is a potential difficulty there, but perhaps we can reflect on what's happened during the crisis and see there may be some opportunities to kind of address issues which are driving the kind of short-term employment at the moment. And then potentially there could be a clear case for ensuring that perhaps the healthcare providers investing in providing more stable employment for people subsequently, which could produce a better response to, unfortunately, another crisis when and if that emerges, I think. So yeah, I understand the point. Perhaps we can learn from the reasons behind what's happened now and maybe address that for the future eventualities.
Thank you very much, Eamonn. We'll take more questions, which I see popping up in the chat later on. I'd like to go back for a second to Dajna because since we've been discussing about the vulnerable groups, there's something which I'm curious about. in Albania, has something changed during the pandemic for vulnerable groups, except from potentially the size of these groups?
Okay, I think the pandemic definitely has re-emphasized the need for addressing the added vulnerabilities that different groups actually face. So what we have noticed from the people that have left the labor market, it's of course women were more adversely affected by the pandemic. Younger workers as well as older workers in the 55 plus age group have also exited numbers, as we also know that that Roma and Egyptians as well have also been negatively, quite adversely impacted by the pandemic. However, our approach at this point has really been that what we need to address is the compounding vulnerabilities that an individual faces. We had already started with a revision of active labor market programs specifically in this direction. In the past, we have had programs that target women. We have had programs that target young people, programs that affect people with disabilities. What we have done instead now with the new programs, we really are trying to address the vulnerabilities that the individual is. So in other words, if you're a woman in the labor market, you are relatively more disadvantaged than a man. However, if you are a woman from, that is heading a single-headed household, you are obviously more vulnerable than a married woman in the labor market. If you are a woman from a Roma community, you have an added level of disadvantage. If you add on disability to it, it's even more vulnerable in the labor market. So what we have done is we have added additional level of support to the existing ALMPs to address these added vulnerabilities. For instance, if for a regular job seeker, a subsidized employment program is only 4 months in duration, it can be extended to 6 months if you're a woman. It can be extended to 12 months if you're a person with disability. If you are, for instance, a woman that has children at a young age, what we have allowed for is subsidies for childcare for these women. Or if you reside in a rural areas with little access to jobs, what we have added is a transport allowance. So in other words, to address the added vulnerabilities that an individual has, we have designed support packages to make it possible for these individuals to enter into the labor market. I want to emphasize one point in particular. We are noticing that women, even though they exited in greater numbers at the beginning, they are also returning faster than men. What is of particular concern to Albania, it's what is happening with young people, particularly those individuals that are exiting the education system, that exited in 2020 or are exiting now in 2021. Their transition to the labor market is really crucial. Cristina mentioned it earlier that the past has shown us some evidence, and really, for instance, from the crisis of 2008, we saw that young people face an added challenge. For us, addressing the needs of this category, this vulnerable category in particular, youth neither in employment nor in education and training, it's really a priority, at least for our government. Thank you.
Thank you, Dajna. We'll discuss just to address our followers. For example, Mohammed Elaga, who is asking questions about TVET. So we'll switch to the skills development in the last bit of this conversation. But before taking your question, Mohammed, I'd like to give the floor to Eamonn to ask him, as a matter of perspective, if you can give us some concrete examples of how public employment services were innovated during the pandemic, and so as to provide an inspiration, and a provocative question. in the end, is it all about making things more digital, Eamonn?
If I may start on the second one, because there are lots of good examples and I'm conscious of the time and I'll touch on those if I can, but the report is full of many good examples. But I think essentially technology is in many regards neutral, and it's about the context within which you deploy it. I think potentially digital development has great potential to really assist the integration of inactive and long-term unemployed people, but that depends on certain things happening. I'd really like to strongly reinforce Christina's very helpful point about the need for the right performance measures for the very long-term unemployed and the inactive. The so-called soft measures, which probably should not be called soft measures, distance travelled metrics, can be very, very helpful. And I'll commend a report to you which was produced by the European Union last year, commissioned from Warwick University actually in the UK, looking at distance travelled models, which can be a very useful way of assessing the success of programs. So I don't think it's all about digital, but digital does have quite a lot of potential. In Belgium, there are some very good examples now about real-time tracking people's progress towards integration. And potentially you can, by using digital support methods, give the individual job seeker and citizen much more control over their own reintegration journey. And you can very much develop autonomy on the part of the job seeker and give them a sense more of being able to develop their own program and doing what is good for them from their own perspective, rather than having things done to them, which I think can be quite helpful in terms of a better longer term employment and integration. However, on the more specific points, of course, that all depends on people having the required digital access, and the digital divide is very real. And so all of those very interesting and exciting developments will only succeed if we are able to make sure that nobody is digitally excluded. So in terms of the first part of your question, part of the agenda, of course, was how public employment services could approach a situation where their more traditional face-to-face contact media was no longer possible. I think across most of the world, until perhaps very recently, even right up until COVID, the view was that the hardest to integrate long-term unemployed people probably were more likely to require and wish for more face-to-face intervention, and it was more of the people who could better help themselves who were moving onto the kind of digital contact channels. So in response to COVID, in countries where there was already a very strong digital delivery backbone and system, perhaps Estonia, Norway, Sweden, and others, the transition wasn't so dramatic because much of their delivery model was already online. However, in many other parts of Europe and in other parts of the world, and of course in many of the partnership countries, the delivery model was far more heavily focused on face-to-face support for all clients. In that regard, countries made some very quick and expedient and creative adjustments, I think. For part of our work looking at the study, we looked very closely at North Macedonia and Moldova, where very quickly government's employment services took a strategic decision to decide which functions could move online, which would have to be suspended, and where you did need to maintain face-to-face services, what were the ones that were most essential for the benefit of the service users, and where there was a need to ease some of the legal requirements to maintain some face-to-face service to make sure that urgent need was still met. That was the decision that was taken, which I think was very sensible. Bulgaria felt it had to maintain really a face-to-face service without moving to many other channels because of the current position in regard to digital connectivity with the population, but they managed to maintain services by deciding that they would again focus on certain interventions and others would be suspended for the period of the crisis. In Morocco, there was an extension of the use of mobile units, particularly to people in very rural areas where digital connections are often absent or certainly much less reliable than in more urban areas. And that was used as a way to make sure that during the crisis, certain people were not excluded altogether from support. And certainly looking again at our study, I think in North Macedonia, the employment service was able to maintain a very high proportion of its programmed activities despite the onset of COVID-19, because it decided to prioritise activities based on the channels that were available, which I think was a fairly kind of innovative and strategic approach. Interestingly, Slovenia rather was able to rather rapidly move towards lots of services going online, but immediately when they were able to offer citizens more of a traditional service offering, many citizens opted to go back to face-to-face contact, even though they didn't necessarily have to, which is quite interesting. So there's perhaps something about the way people perceive services and what they expect, and maybe people need some experience of successful digital delivery for a certain period before they're happy to kind of transit to it longer term. And interesting. And perhaps finally, we did come across a very interesting program from the Ukraine, where the government organized a help the needy approach, which was targeting vulnerable people by contacting people who did have some digital connections and asking those if they could make sure they could advise on people who didn't have digital links, who were perhaps in precarious situations, which is a very nice kind of communitarian approach to kind of bridging the digital divide. And that gives interesting pause for thought about how perhaps longer term we could start to extend digital connections to some of the more excluded populations that the Minister mentioned as well, and build more confidence in digital services overall. So I think there was quite significant innovation. Obviously easier for countries who already have the digital support, and obviously a need to ensure that we can bridge the digital divide going forward.
Thank you so much, Eamonn. We have 7 minutes to go till the end of this conversation, and I think it's very relevant to now put let's say the provision of training under the spotlight, because Cristina, for months, also Eamonn mentioned vocational education. Vocational students have been missing practical courses and internships. I'd like to ask you whether we can quantify the impact of this phenomenon and whether we will have a generation of disrupted millennials. And I'd like also to bring in the question from Mohamed Elaga from Gaza. He's asking, what do you think about the integration between TVET and labor market in the vulnerable industries such as developing countries like Palestine? From our experience, we adopted a special tool, which is apprenticeship scheme, but unfortunately it is applicable in project-funded courses. So if you can bring into the discussion also some of the contributions from Mohamed. Cristina.
Thanks. No, excellent questions, and I see also the exchange. Definitely, I don't think we will deal with one generation, but already 2 generations of graduates that faced huge disruption in their education pathways and experience. So we don't talk about a poor labor market with difficulties in job generation and so on, and all the risks of a pandemic and post-pandemic times, but also we talk about a problem with the future generations in terms of skills acquisition, readiness to integrate on labor market. And beyond these 2 reports that will be published, I just want to go back to another report that we did with UNICEF, and it's published on our website. Last December, we interviewed, thanks to UNICEF, more than 15,000 young people on how the pandemic impacted their life, education experience, labor market expectations, and so on. And it was quite not unexpected, but a bit scary to see that most of their feelings and attitudes, and from the focus groups, they were naming, and I quote now, "What is this COVID for you?" They mentioned crisis, fear, problems, closure, limits, loss, awful, terrible. So we need to take into account not only, I mean, when we will design this new generation of labor market policies, but also enhance this remedial education that is absolutely necessary for those that were affected. We need to take into account also this element of personal fragility. Of how do we invest in counseling, in coaching, and so on, because we will deal with people that will face a lot of problems in the integration in the labor market, but also they will need skills and maybe counter check of the skills acquisition. They had huge loss in terms of practical skills, internships, apprenticeships, practical skills programs were impossible to implement in lockdown conditions. But also, and Ms. Sorensen mentioned, there was a huge pressure on companies as well. So companies prioritize their own survival over hosting apprentices and trainees. And to a certain extent, it's absolutely understandable. And this situation will continue. So how the public authorities will come up with some solutions to make and to close this gap, that's a priority. That's a priority for all of us, to find, again, affordable solutions, not the state-of-the-art solutions, because we know what are the sources available, to make the best of EU funding that is now prepared and will become available in the EU neighborhood, and donor support and also collaboration. I just want to underline also the potential of young and to remember now nice examples from Albania, where youth organizations have stepped in and also support with their activism and volunteers. They supported vulnerable people, but also it's exactly like the Ukraine case, where young people with good knowledge, digital knowledge and skills, they manage to support also those in vulnerable situations.
Thank you so much, Cristina. Quick round now to Dajna on again on skills. What's the place of skills in the Albanian policies for activating and increasing the participation in the labor market so as to increase competitiveness? Dajna.
I mean, obviously there is no time for me to make the full case for the need to invest in skills. I'll just focus on two main priorities that we have. For us, it's really important to venture beyond the acquisition of basic skills into medium and higher skills, particularly referring to young people in particular. So in other words, in parallel, both with the most vulnerable, but really with anybody that needs to transition into the labor market. And the second thing is expanding the offer of vocational training in general, or upskilling pathways for individual at all ages. I think it's important for us at any level, at any age, to recognize that we have a need for, skilling upwards and getting additional new skills. And it is a responsibility of governments to make sure that there is an offer there. In the Albanian context, our priority now is to tap into the private sector, because again, they are also a very good source for training, and especially the private sector in terms of vocational training providers.
Thank you so much.
Wrap it up as quickly as possible.
Yeah, no, and I'm very grateful because we have one more minute, and this is for Eamonn to close the conversation with a provocative question, because I like to do these ones. Eamonn, will the labor market policies be more oriented to protecting all jobs or to skilling people for future ones? What do you expect?
Apologies to interrupt there. I think it'll possibly be with both. There are examples of some very useful and creative approaches to assist employers during periods of drop in demand during the crisis. However, there is a particular strategic interest in programs to try and support so-called sunrise industries. I think there is a strong degree of logic in that, but we should not obviously kind of leave a sector kind of unsupported where there are still viable jobs there. I think it's about maintaining a balance, but clearly there needs to be more, particularly to ensure that longer term unemployed and inactive people are training for jobs, the jobs of the future. And in that regard, VET needs to be clearly informed by employability kind of criteria, lots of employer input into training programs to make sure they reflect employer needs. I think that's pretty essential as well. Going forward, and finally, needs to be as much cohesion as possible between skills policy and employment policy and the training sector.
Thank you very much. So thanks a million to our distinguished guest speakers of today's Learning Connects about labor market policies for recovery. Dajna Sorensen, Deputy Minister of Finance and Economy at the Ministry of Finance and Economy of Albania. Thank you very much, Dajna. It seems that you are freezed. Okay, well, thanks a million to Dajna. Thanks a lot to Eamonn Davern, Senior Labor Market Expert from Fondazione Giacomo Brodolini. Thank you, Eamonn.
Thank you. It's very interesting. Thank you very much. Great pleasure. And it's a shame an hour goes very quickly, doesn't it? But it'd be nice to have a longer further discussion. But thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much. Dajna, we've just thanked you, but apparently you were freeze. So thanks again to Dajna Sorensen.
Well, thank you very much. I just lost the connection for a minute there.
Thanks a million. And also thanks to Cristina Mereuta, Labour Market Specialist at the European Training Foundation.
Thanks a lot. It was a pleasure, and we will continue this kind of exchanges. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thanks a million to all of you who've been following this conversation and participating actively. We'll see each other again next Wednesday, same time, 4 p.m. Central European time, for another conversation, which will be focusing on green skills. So don't miss that. Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye.